Good morning. I'm with the campaign family, and we're here to give a mission moment on Russell Campaign. And I'd like to have both my boys talk a little bit about what we did last week in the PF program, and then I'll sum it up at the end.
I'm Owen Campaign. I'm a junior in high school. So I was part of the group that went into New Haven, and we worked on 2 houses. There were 2 groups that split off after we had breakfast together. We found a great COVID workaround for the mission trip that we usually do over spring break. It was fun. It was very sad that we didn't get to go off to various places like Pennsylvania, where we were supposed to go. But we found a great workaround, and I had lots of fun working, and it was great to help the community.
My name's Ian, and I'm a freshman, and this is my first year PF. And in my group, we worked at the church, and we made things like birdhouses, picnic tables, and in my group, we did Adirondack chairs. And similar to Owen, we have found a workaround for COVID. And despite not being able to go on a mission trip, this was very fun. It was an interesting experience.
And I've been working with the PF program for almost 25 years, and really it was a disappointment last year when we weren't able to go on the trip due to COVID. But we were very excited to be able to put together this trip, or this local work group participation, and I think it worked very successfully to keep people engaged and have a role in the community to be able to give back. I oversaw the Adirondack chairs and worked mostly with the younger kids to try and engage them so that they can hopefully go on a trip next year when things open up again. But it's just a wonderful program. It's really exciting to have both of my kids now participating in it, and I really look forward to the future of it. Judy and the church has been such a fantastic support for the program, and we really want to continue to give back and participate in it to see how the kids grow in the community, support we gain, as well as all we're able to give back. Thank you.
Our reading today comes from the Gospel of John, the 21st chapter. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "We'll go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. And when they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, and 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. May God grant us wisdom and understanding in the reading and hearing of this text.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's hard to believe it's been Almost a month already of working together during Ginger's sabbatical interim time, and what fun we are having. Tilapia. Of all things, tilapia. Conservative biblical literalist fringe online blogs, academic progressive scholars, and ancient world angler archaeologists can agree on one thing. It was almost certainly tilapia. Sometimes in tradition called St. Peter's fish, or musht, meaning comb in Arabic because its tail actually resembles a comb, the fish that Jesus cooked and the disciples ate at the Sea of Galilee was a species of tilapia, not unlike what we can buy today at Big Y, although significantly less factory farmed. I was hoping when I read this passage for something tastier on a barbecue grill, like salmon or trout, but everyone agrees it was most likely tilapia. I sure hope Jesus had some harissa or satar to add some flavor that day. Regardless, I love that in this day and age when we cannot even seem to agree between conservative and progressive Christians on the flavor of water, that there remains universal agreement on one thing. It was tilapia. One credible source narrowed it down this way. According to records, there are 27 species of fish in the Sea of Galilee, and of these, only 10 are prized by fishermen. These 10 species divide into 3 categories: the musht or tilapia, the sardine, and the baini or barbel. Of these, the sardine is straight out because it is generally too small to catch in a net, and they were usually used for pickling. And we know that the apostles cooked their fish on the fire. John described the fish caught in the apostles' net as large. So we need to look at fish large enough to be caught in a net, while too big for the 7 apostles to hoist out of the water. The baini is certainly large enough to be a candidate, as they can grow to be about 4 feet long and weigh 25 pounds. However, the baini requires bait to catch, and thus would require a hook and line rather than a net. This brings us to the musht, or tilapia, that exists in 5 species within the Sea of Galilee. One of these varieties reaches 1.5 feet long, weighing 4 to 5 pounds. A haul of 153 musht could weigh upwards of 750 pounds, which would explain why the disciples could not pull the net from the water. Okay, so this quote and analysis is proof certain that people are fascinated by and will study the most minute detail of Scripture with passion. So by process of elimination, tilapia. We have come full circle today back to Galilee, back to the fishing, back to Jesus feeding people with tilapia. We are back with the disciples today in John 21, sitting with Jesus at seaside picnic tables and taking nutrition for the journey ahead. That is significant in this Eastertide. We find ourselves again with Jesus and the tilapia. The Gospel of John pastorally ends with community, with food, and with a place of home and familiar. This is particularly interesting because John is a particularly tumultuous, unusual, and polemical gospel. But it concludes, it ends with this picnic table quiet with Christ. Unlike the earlier 3 so-called synoptic or summary gospels in modern English, something very different is happening here in John. The Gospel of Matthew ends grandly with the Matthean Great Commission and a spectacular ascension. The Gospel of Mark originally ends, if we look at the Greek, with the disciples literally running away from the tomb in terror and fear and absolute bewilderment. It was altered later to also be about the ascension. And the Gospel of Luke ends with, he led them out as far as Bethany. Basically, only as far as the suburbs of Jerusalem, something like North Haven to New Haven. And lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. In all three cases, ascension, withdrawing, distancing. Our reading today is the conclusion of the most cosmic and otherworldly of the Gospels, and yet chapter 21 of John is the most intimate and comforting, sort of paradoxical. Here, the Gospel of John purposefully ends differently. Tilapia. It concludes with this intimate encounter with the risen Christ, a reunion back where it all began at the Sea of Galilee, cooking and eating, sharing and conversation, tilapia and bread. Geographically, unlike Luke, Matthew, and Mark, we have left Jerusalem and its suburbs and the places of death. Easter Jesus in John has returned home. He reenacts the calling of the disciples at the place where his movement began. Scholars agree that chapter 21 of John was a later addition to this gospel by the Johannine community. Yet it is no less authoritative and thought-provoking in our canon. Chapter 21 was put there as the conclusion for a reason. Why? I believe that Jesus returns here to Church 101, back to basics, back to the shoreline, for his last moments on earth for a reason. And what does he do here? He practices radical hospitality through the sharing of table and making a meal. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there. We can almost hear the crackling. We can smell the warmth. With the fish, the tilapia on it, and the bread, and Jesus said, "Come and have breakfast." Jesus came and took and gave the bread to them and the fish, sort of enacting the Last Supper in a way, reminiscing of Sermon on the Mount as well, sort of like a greatest hits. This was the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Then, for almost the rest of the passage of John 21, all the way to the end of the gospel, there's small talk at breakfast. Jesus talks about love and caring. He asks, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." What a different conclusion. What a different way to set up the church. What this immediately brought to mind and heart for me is the writings of the late Dr. Letty Russell of Yale Divinity School and a member of First Church. In her book, Just Hospitality, God's Welcome in a World of Difference, which I have cited before from other passages, she writes about the definition of hospitality. Professor Russell wrote, "What do we mean by hospitality? Although hospitality is a form of Christian spirituality and it is basic to the biblical message, the practice of biblical hospitality has fallen into disuse in our churches and society. Hospitality is the practice of God's welcome by reaching across difference to participate in God's actions, bringing justice and healing to a world in crisis. Such action is not easy, yet the biblical witness is clear. This practice of hospitality is the ministry of all the members of congregation, and not just the church's women's groups, welcoming committees, or clergy. It is a gift that transcends real differences through participation in the mission and ministry of the church on behalf of the healing of the brokenness of the world. And then she adds, beginning with ourselves. I think this is what Ginger and Milton intended for us to think about this next week, as Ginger has challenged us as part of the Renewal in Place lectionary to, quote, learn to cook something new, and then in parentheses, or something. We are preparing ourselves for the very real, very urgent, very fundamentally Christian need to learn how to practice hospitality again after the pandemic. The time is coming when the reservation system on our in-person worship will go away, and we will need to learn how to offer hospitality. It's not yet, but it will come. Like what Letty Russell described in her book, we need to do this with new and yet unfelt urgency in the modern, emerging post-pandemic church. And friends, here's the hard part. We're going to have to learn some new recipes, both for food and community. Not everyone eats tilapia anymore. I do mean that both literally and metaphorically. We need to find more sustainable recipes, more resilient recipes to show hospitality in this new and emerging world. Unlike midsummer, we've had to keep the reservation system, but the time is coming to start preparing. As Professor Letty Russell said, this practice must begin with ourselves. It is a gift that transcends real difference through participation in the mission and ministry of the church on behalf of the healing and the brokenness of the world, beginning with ourselves. The spiritual practice of the potluck, the all come, the abundant welcome must return sooner than later. This is not only for the sake of institutional survival and thriving, but also spiritual sustenance, the Jesus tilapia of the soul. It's time to start practicing new recipes for healing. It's time to start experimenting with new recipes for church and community. In some ways, this scene with Jesus at the seaside in Galilee is incredibly sad if you think about it. You can almost hear the early morning silence. And we don't know how long it has been since chapter 20 back in Jerusalem. All it says at the beginning of chapter 21 is, after these things. Is this a day after? Or many years after? We have no idea how long it has been. All we know is that the disciples' great adventure of living with and following Jesus of Nazareth in person, the Son of God, is now past. Now they have returned to their old lives. They are fishermen eking out a living again. In some ways, we imagine that they are in bereavement at the loss of the old ways, the loss of their friend, Jesus, and feeling the loss of a way of life with Jesus and his presence when he comes back to them as a stranger in this story. This chapter 21 scene feels like Jesus coming to us and sharing a familiar meal in these glimmers of a new and different world. We can't go back, but Jesus is with us. He is a stranger, yet we recognize him. We are sad about what we've lost. We are so tired. We have lost track of our sense of time over this past year, and yet we recognize still the sacred when it shows up. In 2018, Guilford town historian and First Church member Joel Helander wrote a fabulous article called Bounties from the Sea, a short history of fishing and shellfishing in Guilford. I recommend it. In it, he writes, "We often forget about how much of Guilford's prosperity depends on the sea, with its tangy breezes and hidden treasures." Don't you love the way Joel writes? Harvesting the bounties of fish and shellfish from Long Island Sound is a practice older than the town itself. Indeed, Native American communities for 1,000, 5,000, 8,000 years before the town's founding practiced this form of agriculture. Eastern woodland Indians tribes established summer encampments on our shores in these prehistoric eras. They dug clams and oysters and netted fish for a mainstay of their diets. When Reverend Henry Whitfield and his company of English Puritans founded the town in 1639, they found heaps of shells on the cleared flatlands, or the Great Plain of Guilford, below what is now the town green. Tilapia, thankfully in my opinion, isn't native to Long Island Sound. We have things that are much more scrumptious than that. We have our own ancient food traditions, and our conservation efforts are making incremental work in our waters. Guilford, what recipes are we called to try today? This passage, possibly added later as a necessity for the community from John 21, is a timeless story of Jesus coming to find us where we are. It is a story of comfort in loss and bereavement. It is a story of table talk about love. It is a story of the familiar and unfamiliar times. It is a story, as it turns out, about tilapia. Of all things, tilapia. Conservative biblical fundamentalists, academic progressive scholars, and ancient world angler archaeologists can agree on one thing. It was almost certainly tilapia. If we can start by agreeing on what kind of fish, maybe we can start cooking together again. It may, however, require us to find entirely new recipes for common ground here on this sacred Great Plain of Guilford, where recipes for community from the sea have been shared for over 8,000 years. We are called to do nothing less as humans, as people, and especially as followers of the great chef of hospitality, Jesus the Christ. What's your recipe for radical hospitality? And are you ready to get cooking? Amen.